A little 5-year-old was being very uncooperative as her mom was trying to get them ready to leave. The mom said if they didn't hurry, they would be late to the baby shower, in which the 5-year-old asked, why can't they wash their own baby? And perhaps there's been moments in our lives where we misunderstood someone or we misunderstood something that later, hopefully, we were able to understand and see it differently as we got older. And maybe you were sitting here and you're thinking of different moments that this has actually happened to you over the years, whether it's serious or not so serious moments. How many of you have heard this statement right here? I was today years old when ... You discovered something that you thought it was the other way this whole time, and now somebody has enlightened you and you're just refreshed by it because you've just learned something new that really has been that way this whole time. You just understood it differently. Where this happens the most, it seems like, is with little kids as they're trying to grow up and understand these things in this world. So I got curious and I took to the internet at first, and I decided to figure out what are some things that people misunderstood growing up. And here's a few examples. I used to think, not me, but this person used to think that raising a child was lifting a child up over your head like they do in The Lion King. So I just kept telling my mom that we hadn't done that yet with my 3-month-old brother and we needed to raise him. The steam that came from a power plant was actually clouds, and the plant itself was a cloud maker, and that's how we got all the clouds in the sky, and I believed it for years. I always thought there was some kind of animal in my dad's muscle car. He said that she roared like a beast. So anytime I was in the garage, I would tiptoe around the car so that I wouldn't wake up the beast. I would genuinely get mad at my mom for not driving to the end of the rainbow to get the pot of gold and fix her money problems. Instead, she would just laugh at me. A friend at the age of 34 just now realized the correct pronunciation of Arkansas, in which they said Arkansas. This person thought the presidential race was a literal race, like a marathon, and the winner was going to be the president. It's a good thing that's not the case with these two candidates we have. So then I got curious again, and I decided to put a message out on Facebook, which many of you saw. And so the responses I'm now about to give you come from the people that are sitting in this room. I did not bring their names to light. If they want to tell you it was them, by all means, they can tell you. For example, in passing this morning, I'll say this one before I forget, someone told me that for years, whenever the Star Spangled Banner was sung, they just wanted to know who Jose was. This person thought that cruise control meant that whoever was driving could get in the back seat with me and the car would just drive wherever we're going. One person asked, why don't you ask for a hair's cut, not a haircut? You're getting all of them cut, right? One person was told that the thunder was the sound of clouds that would smash into each other. And then we had a family send in 3, and they did not tell me their names. They didn't want me to know. But here's what they said. This person thought that if you sprinkle salt on a bird's tail, you can catch the bird. One thought that a chicken had both front legs and back legs. And if you pick up a skunk by its tail, it will not spray you. One person thought that their dad was capable of flying around like Batman in order to stop crime. And many of you probably heard this one. I know I have. If you cross your eyes, they will get stuck that way. One person thought that whenever the contribution was happening at church, that you were paying for the refreshments at church, which was the crackers and the juice. One person said that anytime they had a splinter, that their mom would tell them that if they would just go to bed, they would wiggle around in their sleep, and the sheets would pull the splinter out. They believed it for years. One person thought that if a toad would pee on you, you would get a wart. One person thought they could reassure their sibling that it wasn't illegal to keep the light on in the back seat as long as your parents are driving. And I remember even growing up, the different things that I would think myself. I used to think that when it was dark and I was in a room and I had to turn the light off and it was going to make it really dark, I would always think that I would have to run to go back to the light so that nothing would be able to grab me or catch me when it got really dark. Someone told me that you cannot hide from God. And I said, all right, bet. So I would literally walk around and I would find the best hiding spots I thought that I could find, and I would say, there is no way God can see me right now. This is what I would think. And so these are all things that we look back at and we laugh at and we think it's silly, but that's just where our minds were at that particular moment in time whenever we were growing up. That's the way that we understood it. But aren't you thankful, though, that you've had the luxury to grow, and as you've gotten older, you can process things much differently now, at least we hope, right? Like, for example, the person who thought that cruise control meant the car would drive on its own when he got in the back seat, I'm sure we're all thankful that they still don't think that. Otherwise, we'd be in trouble when we got in our vehicles this afternoon. What about the way that we understand and think when it comes to our spiritual growth? Our spiritual growth. Have you grown spiritually as you've gotten older? Growth is something that we all the time see when we look around us. We see it all the time in the physical sense. We look at height, we look at weight, we look at size of clothes, we look at development in general, people's physical stature. And based on observation, we can look at people and we can, for the most part, guess in a roundabout area about how old somebody is, although it's probably not wise to do that with some people. But based on how they look, how we observe them, we can sort of make that guess in a physical sense. What if somebody was to guess your spiritual age? What do you think they would say? This morning, what I want us to do is I want us to think about our own spiritual journeys that we're on. Because every single one of us has had a different starting point at some point in our life when it comes to spiritual thoughts, when it comes to spiritual thinking, or when it comes to being a spiritual baby in your life. Everybody's got a different moment or different point. For example, who or what got you started coming to church? Or understand you're starting to think about the idea of Jesus? Who did that? Where did that come from? So there was a starting point at some point, even if it's your first time at church today and you're sitting here, who or what got you here? We all had different starting points. So as we reflect on our spiritual journeys today, beginning at our starting points, let's think about that with the perspective and comparison of another spiritual journey that happens in Scripture. So I'm going to have it on the screen, but if you want to follow along in your Bibles, I'm going to spend the entire time this morning in the book of John, and we're just going to follow a trail. So if you want to, go ahead and open up to John chapter 1, verses 43, and we're going to see a starting point here. Here's what it says. The following day, Jesus wanted to go to Galilee, and he found Philip and said to him, "Follow me." Well, right in there, Philip was found by Jesus, and his spiritual journey is going to take off. But just because you start, does that mean that's it? Is it just whatever it is from that point on? Well, let's keep reading, and let's see if there's anything else to it. Now, Philip was from Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter. Philip found Nathanael and said to him, "We have found him of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, son of Joseph." And Nathanael said to him, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" Philip said to him, "Come and see." Well, he went from his starting point, in which he then turned around and found someone else to share it with him. You don't find something unless you are intentional about it, or if it's fresh on your mind and you can't help but talk about it. So he went, found Nathanael, he wanted to share it with him. Nathanael's going to question him, and Philip's just at a point where he says, "Just come and see, come and look at this guy." It's almost like you get a sense that at Philip's starting point, he is rejuvenated, he's refreshed, he's excited, he's trying to bring people with him. If you're sitting here and you're a Christian, can you go back to the moment of the day you became a Christian? Can you remember the day? Can you remember the people? Can you remember the feeling? I can remember it. I can remember the people that were there. I can remember the feeling of coming up out of that water, having my sins washed away, and being a brand new person, all because of the gospel of Jesus Christ. I was excited. I was on fire. And I couldn't help but go tell people, "Hey, guess what I just did? Guess what I just did?" I wanted everybody to know. I wanted everybody to know. That was my starting point. But again, is that it? Is that all there is to it? Is there more to it? Well, we're only in the first chapter here, so why don't we follow Philip's trail and let's see what happens to Philip. So the next time we see Philip is in John chapter 6 when Jesus is getting ready to feed the 5,000. And here's what it says. Then Jesus lifted up his eyes and seeing a great multitude coming toward him, he said to Philip, where shall we buy bread that these may eat? But this he said to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread is not sufficient for them, that every one of them may have a little. What's interesting here is that in this little detail, Jesus is going to test Philip. Jesus himself knew what he was going to do, and he had it all under control, but he has provided a spiritual opportunity for Philip here. So how has Philip been doing so far since his starting point? It was back in chapter 1. Here we are 5 chapters later. Philip's on his journey, his spiritual journey. Jesus is going to test him. Testing happens all the time when we see how far we've come. It's a way to measure us. It's a way to test our quality. And yet, in this opportunity to grow, Philip appears to do what perhaps many of us have often done ourselves in our walk. A situation is presented to Philip that is beyond his control, and he literally begins to do a physical calculation in his head on how he can answer this question and solve this problem. In other words, Philip tries to take something that's out of his control, and he's trying to figure out how he himself can do it physically without even looking to Jesus to find the solution. What am I going to do? How can I fix this? And yet we think the same thing a lot of times when we have a test right in front of us on a spiritual level, an opportunity to do something with our spiritual thinking to grow, and yet the natural inclination within us is to take this situation and think, all right, I've got this. What can I do? How am I going to fix it? And then here's the unfortunate part to this. Because it is out of our control, and it's evident that we're not capable of doing anything about it, here comes all the stress and the worry that follows behind that decision. And as that stress and worry set in, the spiritual opportunity that has been given to us has now led to an unsuccessful physical opportunity that's now hindered our spiritual growth. Philip's lack of spiritual growth has been exposed based on this test so far in his journey, but hey, it's only chapter 6. Will Philip figure this out? Well, the next time he's presented with another situation happens in chapter 12. Now, there were certain Greeks among those who came up to worship at the feast. And they came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida of Galilee, and asked him, saying, Sir, we wish to see Jesus. Philip came and told Andrew, and in turn, Andrew and Philip told Jesus. So these Greeks come to Philip because they want to see Jesus. So far, so good. But instead of Philip answering the request and taking them to Jesus, he goes to Andrew first. And people all around can't really figure out why necessarily Philip did this, but we can speculate a little bit. Why didn't Philip just take them to see Jesus when they asked? Why did he have to go to Andrew? Well, these Greeks are Gentiles, so maybe Philip could be thinking to himself, okay, what is the protocol here for Jesus and the Gentiles? We know that there's a protocol for Jesus and the Jews, but what about the Gentiles? Philip could have found himself here in a spiritual dilemma. He didn't know how to process this. He didn't know how to think about it, and so he needed help. He didn't really know what to do, and so then he goes to Andrew. But what's interesting, though, is that as soon as he gets to Andrew, it seems like Andrew immediately knew what to do. Philip didn't know what to do, but Andrew knew what to do because the reaction to this is they go and take him to Jesus. And a while back, when I did a sermon based on Andrew, you picked up a theme on Andrew that Andrew was the guy who was always finding a way to bring people to Jesus anyway. And yet Philip was stuck on that for some reason. So if Philip is struggling in his spiritual thinking, development, and growth, like we saw in the previous example, perhaps this was the reason why he found himself in a spiritual dilemma and he didn't know what to do. He didn't know how to think about it. He didn't know how to go about it. If you can't grow in certain aspects in one area, then it's also going to be hard to grow in other aspects as well. If I were to take my 3 boys, Hudson, Jack, and Isaac, and I were to go out in the yard with them, Hudson's 2, Jack is 4, Isaac is 8, and I wanted to throw a ball with them, based on their development, I'm going to throw the ball differently to each one of them. That only makes sense, right? Based on where they're at and how they can develop process in catching the ball, I cannot throw the ball to Isaac the same way I throw, or I can't throw the ball to Hudson, who's 2, the same way I'm going to throw the ball to my 8-year-old. You know why? Because Hudson just hasn't developed and got there yet. And so what I have to do is I have to hold the ball ever so lightly, and I have to come up to Hudson and just lightly toss it to him, hoping that he understands what I'm doing. If I were to do that to Isaac, Isaac would be like, okay, come on, give me something to challenge here. But it's because there's been a process that's taken place in growth and development. If you can't grow in one part, how can you continue to get to this part if there's a hindrance? Why did Philip go to Andrew? There could have been other options, but he picks Andrew. So at this point in Philip's spiritual journey, what I've done is I have intentionally left Andrew out. But the reality is, in all 3 examples that we've looked at so far, Andrew is right there with Philip in the same context. The same context. So it's almost as if John was intentional by putting Philip and Andrew together in these situations, because the biblical writers were very good at putting characters together and contrasting them, making you see the difference in them, to learn something from both of them. So now, here's what we're going to do. Let's go back to our previous examples, but this time we're going to include Andrew. And what I want you to do is I want you to keep in mind the spiritual journey, but I want you to notice the difference between Andrew and Philip when they had the same starting point. So back to chapter 1. These are the verses right before we get introduced to Philip. Then Jesus turned and seeing them following, said to them, "What do you seek?" They said to him, "Rabbi," which is to say, when translated, teacher, "where are you staying?" So he said to them, "Come and see." They came and saw where he was staying and remained with him that day. Now it was about the 10th hour. One of the 2 who heard John speak and followed him was Andrew, Simon Peter's brother. He first found his own brother Simon and said to him, "We have found the Messiah," which is translated, the Christ, and he brought him to Jesus. Next verse, here comes Philip. Jesus finds Philip. Philip then takes it, goes and shares it with Nathanael and says, "Come and see Jesus." Basically, Andrew and Philip had the same starting point. They're one day apart from each other. They both find Jesus. They both are excited, and they have to tell somebody about it, and thus both their spiritual journeys have now begun. And so we trace Philip, but now let's go back to the feeding of the 5,000, because we stopped reading right before Andrew was going to enter the scene. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a lad here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish, but what are they among so many?" This was after Philip was getting tested by Jesus, and Philip gets his physical calculation that fails miserably. Andrew then sees the situation, and here's his response. While Philip had a physical mental calculation, Andrew brought the resource to Jesus. As the spiritual journeys have taken off all the way back in chapter 1, when you get to this situation, you see 2 different responses, don't you? 2 different responses. And so now, let's go back to where we were just now in John chapter 12 with the situation with Philip and Andrew. Now maybe we can answer the question on why Philip decided to pick Andrew in this situation. Because Philip didn't know what to do. Andrew immediately knew what to do. So again, why Andrew? Well, even though they both had the same starting point spiritually, at this point in the book, when we're tracing their trail, we can see that they are at 2 different levels of spiritual thinking now that we're in chapter 12 of John. Andrew was moving and growing in his spiritual thinking and faith, but Philip just seems to be clueless. Doesn't seem to be growing very much at all. And so then I'm thinking, what is Philip's deal? What is going on with this guy? In John chapter 14, John is going to give one more incident with Philip. But this time it's without Andrew. And the conversation gets a little serious. Will this be the missing piece of what's going on with Philip? And as you open up in John chapter 14, Jesus is giving very profound and deep spiritual thinking statements. He even says right before this, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." And then you get to verse 7, and it says this. Jesus says, if you had known me, you would have known my Father also. And from now on, you know him and have seen him. Philip, in response to this, says, Lord, show us the Father, and it is sufficient for us. Check out the response that Jesus gives here. Jesus said to him, have I been with you so long, and yet you have not known me, Philip? He who has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, show us the Father? Jesus appears very frustrated with Philip here. But why? Well, throughout Philip's spiritual journey that we've been looking at, what's your perspective on him at this point? It seemed like he has such a great starting point, but what happened? Especially in comparison to Andrew. Based on the book of John, it appears that the apostles had around 3 years with Jesus. So here's the thing. After all the conversations that Philip would have been a part of, including Jesus, after all the miracles that Jesus performed, after all the time they spent with each other, Philip still didn't get it. Philip has seen the character of Jesus, he's heard the words of Jesus, and he's seen the actions of Jesus, and he still didn't get it. Philip gazed at the very face of God for 3 years. He still didn't get it. Wouldn't you get frustrated too if you were Jesus at this point? And if we keep reading, Jesus is going to get to the root of the problem here. So if we keep reading in the next 2 verses, it says, do you not believe that I am in the Father, and the Father in me? The words that I speak to you, I do not speak on my own authority, but the Father who dwells in me, who does the works. Believe me that I am in the Father, and the Father in me, or else believe me for the sake of the works themselves. Jesus looks at Philip and says, do you not believe? How could you say that to somebody who started following you, who's been with you? Well, this idea of believe that Jesus brings up here, if you look at this word in both the Old Testament and New Testament, it's not just merely acknowledging something to be true. It's not either the popular notion of having this deep emotional resonance. It's a biblical concept involving action. You don't just think and acknowledge, but you turn one's whole self over to this idea. But how can you do that if you're not fully convinced or you haven't allowed yourself to spiritually think in a way to get there? Philip thought he knew Jesus, but he didn't know Jesus. Based on his journey, especially this conversation with Jesus, Philip just didn't change the way he was thinking in a spiritual way. He messed up his spiritual opportunities to grow. If anything, since chapter 1, Philip has stayed a spiritual baby, if not worse. And Jesus is calling him out for this. So as we've looked at Philip's spiritual journey this morning, where are you at in your spiritual journey? Why are you here this morning? Or anytime you choose to come? What's the point in all of this? Do we get it, or are we just here? We can look around and see that everybody's here, and so it appears that everyone seems like they get it, but that is not always the case. I've had the luxury of spending several years in T-ball now, and I've tried to help out in any way I can. And let me just tell you what I get to see whenever a T-ball game happens. At any given moment, we're going to have a kid out there trying to catch a bug in the outfield. We're also going to have some kids who will sit down and they'll start drawing in the dirt, or they'll see how much dirt they can pick up. Or, my favorite, they'll take their helmet, put it on the ground, and fill it up with dirt, and then dump it all out at once. A kid hits a ball, and he runs to third base first instead of first base. A ball gets hit in the air, a player catches it, your T-ball runners just keep on running without tagging up on the base. Then you turn it into a double play, a triple play, and yada, yada, yada. Jack's been playing T-ball. He's 4 years old. At any given moment on defense, here's what Jack's doing. I'm like, Jack. He can't keep his focus. I had a little girl one time. I was standing in the outfield trying to direct traffic here, And there was a little girl who came and stood next to me. And the entire inning of this side of the batting order, she stood next to me and just punched my leg over and over and over again the entire inning. All this is going on, and then you've got the 1, 2, maybe 3 who are there. They're fielding the ball. They're processing it. They know what's going on. They know what to do. They understand the purpose of the game. And so you look at this example of T-ball, and what I'm seeing is that all are on the same team, all are wearing the same uniform, and they're coming together to one place at the right scheduled time, but not everybody gets it. Of all the times that you've been at church, of all the times that you've worshiped, all the times that you've been to a Bible class, all the times that you've been to a devotional, any church activity you've been to, any church trip you've been to, any service project you've been a part of, anything that you've ever jumped into, after it all, do you get it? One of the greats has a quote. It says this right here. It's not the number of hours you practice, it's about the number of hours your mind is present during the practice. And I would even venture to say, apart from this, it's what your mind does outside of the practice and outside of the activities as well. If we don't get it, and we're not changing in our spiritual thinking, in our spiritual growth, then what is it going to take for us to get to that next level for ourselves? To increase our growth, to increase our understanding. Like, what else would have to be said, or what else has to be done in order for anybody to engage a spiritual thinking differently than the way they've ever done it before? And if any of us aren't doing it now, then at what point are we telling ourselves that we're going to start doing it? Philip is proof that you can be around all the spiritual things that you want to be around, including the physical Jesus himself, and still not get it and still be off the mark. This movie came out almost 30 years ago. I hope that some of you have at least seen this. I used to watch this when I was a kid. Okay? Jack is the main character, Robin Williams, great actor. He is born with a syndrome in which he ages 4 times faster than the normal rate. So he appears like he's 40 years old in the movie, but mentally he's only 10 years old. Even though there's humor in the movie, the disparity in the fact that he appears 40, but he's mentally 10, comes with all kinds of problems that the movie has to work through. Just because somebody may appear to be 50, 60, 70, 100 years old spiritually doesn't necessarily mean that's where they're at mentally. And if there's a disparity in how many years physically that we claim to be a Christian, but mentally where we are in how we think spiritually, that disparity too will come with lots of problems and struggles and difficulties as we try to go on our spiritual journey. When we began our thoughts this morning, it started with the humorous misunderstandings that we and others have had as kids. And as I said, hopefully we're thankful that's not the case anymore because we grew out of all those things. But what if we hadn't? What if we hadn't grown through those misunderstandings? And we stayed confused and we didn't develop? At this point, it's really not that funny anymore, is it? It's funny as a kid, but when you're not supposed to think that way and not supposed to acknowledge things that way, it's not that funny anymore. It's not supposed to be that way because we should all know better and we all get into that. We get that in a physical sense. But based on that, and based on the interaction that Jesus had with Philip, it also doesn't appear to be very funny on a spiritual level either. Especially when Jesus himself was frustrated at where Philip was at in his spiritual thinking and his spiritual growth. But despite all this, Philip's spiritual journey isn't over yet. The scripture reading that was read this morning came from John chapter 20, and I don't have it on the PowerPoint. But the reality is spiritual growth, it comes with ups and downs. It comes with victories. It comes with defeats. There's downright struggles as we go and we try to figure it out. It's not easy. But there's something even greater than all those things that can keep us going. And in John chapter 20, Jesus has resurrected. And after Jesus resurrects, who does he want to go see on that very same day? His disciples, which includes Philip. Jesus then tells them, as God has sent me, I am now sending you. And then in the book of Acts, in chapter 1, they're getting ready to start the church in chapter 2. And who's in that list of names that's going to be pivotal in helping the church begin and start growing? It's the disciples that lead the charge, including Philip. Despite Philip's struggles in his growth, it was never too much for the grace of Jesus through his death, burial, and resurrection. That same grace that has been extended to Philip, despite his lack of growth, is the same grace that's extended to all of us in our spiritual journeys today. If you're sitting here and you've not accepted the grace that Jesus freely offers by putting him on in baptism, being made new to start the spiritual journey, what a wonderful opportunity that is today. But that same grace is also extended to those who are on this spiritual journey. And you know what? You're just having a really difficult time right now. But what better opportunity to come to your church family and for everyone to pray together about it. Today is a wonderful day to seize any spiritual opportunity you may need. Where will your spiritual journey take you? If there's anything we can do for anyone this morning, please come while together we stand and sing.